we go back on the record, and I see Carol and Dick are back. I want to wait and just see if Scott is prepared to come back on. All right, seeing Mr. Yaw now back on. Okay, Mr. Edelman, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, I am. Mr. Snook.
Okay. He is here. Let's unmute yourself, Mr. Snook.
Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry, I was muted.
All right, and Eleanor, are you ready?
Yes, Pat, thank you.
Okay, so let's go back on the record, and at this time we'll begin cross-examination, starting with Mr. Edelman.
Thank you very much, Pat. Good evening, John. How are you?
Good evening, pretty well, thank you.
Good, nice to see you.
You too.
John, I have a few questions. I'll try to muddle my way through them. Let's start with your testimony with respect to Landscapes 3 and the Chester County Planning Commission. Isn't it true that there's no specific zoning ordinance provision requiring the applicant to comply with Landscapes 3 or the Chester County Planning Commission's recommendations?
That is true. There are obviously recommendations in the comp plan itself, and the township zoning ordinance asks for consistency with the comp plan. But there's no specific link other than it being a valuable recommendation source to landscapes.
If we could pull up the future land use map PC 23, please.
Sure.
John, isn't it true that PC 23, the future land use map, has different use classifications for the Crebilly farm property than what appears or is listed on the township zoning map?
Oh, absolutely. The comp plan future land use map is based on the sort of idealized or recommended future character of the land. It is not a zoning map.
Okay, so isn't it then true that the zoning ordinance use provisions for a flexible development do not list neighborhood conservation as a principal use?
No, they do not. The term neighborhood conservation is more of an overall term for all residential development and also related development to residential.
And isn't the same correct with respect to not listing greenway or open space as principal uses in a flexible development?
Not in the same terminology, but the whole purpose of the flexible development is to allow you to make those trade-offs between development and open space and preserve potentially greenways.
Okay,
so
they're not listed as principal uses, is that correct?
Well, open space is a required use, but I'm not sure it's listed in the list of uses, permitted uses.
Fair enough, John. Okay, I don't need PC 23 anymore. You can take that down, please. If we could put up PC 24. Okay, John, we have put up PC 24, which is the trails and bikeways plan from the comprehensive plan. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And isn't it correct that there's no specific zoning ordinance provision requiring the applicant to construct a perimeter trail as what is shown on PC 24?
Not specifically. The zoning ordinance provides for provision for trails, but it does not designate specific locations, again, other than the more general requirement to be consistent with the comp plan. The comp plan has done this.
Okay, let's look at this a little bit more detail. Isn't it correct that PC 24 is proposing a connection in the northwest corner of the property to the Arbor View Trail?
Yes.
Okay. And isn't it correct that the applicant doesn't own the land across West Pleasant Grove Road in order to make that connection to the Arbor View Trail?
As far as I know, that's true. Although I will say that this
and in order to
sorry.
construct the trail that runs
Mr. Adelman, I think you can let him expand.
West Pleasant Grove Road frontage from east to west, isn't it true that the applicant would have to disturb certain conservation areas, including woodlands?
Yes, if it was literally linear, as in this conceptual diagram, I would think it should be wiggled, obviously, to go along the creek and then cross the creek and then go close to the frontage again. But this diagram was not intended to be a design.
Okay, well, let's look at PC 25 then. And if we can rotate it as well.
My lovely drawing.
Yes. So, John, on your drawing PC 25, does it also show a proposed location of the trail along West Pleasant Grove Road and generally the same areas?
It does. Although, as I said, when I introduced that, I said that's a generalized location. The main thing is it should obviously not go through the middle of the townhouses, but to avoid the wetland areas in the headwaters of that stream corridor, obviously it could or should go around that. But again, this was merely a generalized indication.
Okay, and also, as you get to the northwestern corner of the property, aren't you depicting the trail going through the crosshatched area?
Yes, or on the edge of it. But that would be, of course, one of the sewer disposal areas, and we obviously don't know for sure what's going to happen with that.
Right, so to the extent that it's a proposed sewage disposal area, would you agree with me that that trail would need to be relocated?
Yes, or else a gap, frankly, in the sewage disposal, given my understanding of what had been proposed. I think you could have a trail go through it, but certainly not an active area of sewage.
Right. I was going to ask you, John, is it ideal to have a trail going through a sewage disposal area, in your opinion?
Not ideal.
Okay. As we go down further south on the western frontage, isn't it true that in the southwestern corner there's considerable primary and secondary conservation areas on the property?
Yes, and that is why I swerved in this again, merely diagrammatic suggestion, swerved it up to the top of the Radley Run, that branch, that's the main branch of the Radley Run corridor. I also intentionally swung it around the historical residence that is right on New Street, that is being retained, I believe, by a family member.
And what you've depicted there in the southwest corner on Exhibit PC 25, that's different than what is depicted on Exhibit PC 24 with respect to connecting the perimeter trail. Is that correct in that corner?
Yes. The comp plan diagram was even more diagrammatic, and this is attempting to be somewhat more specific, but also to very specifically indicate the idea that this is a generalized location and that it should, in fact, wiggle. But the key point of it is to have a relatively perimeter connection that is not invading the middle of people's neighborhoods.
If we could take PC 25 down for a moment. So, John, you had substantial testimony with respect to the potential historic connection of the property to the Brandywine National Battlefield or the Brandywine Battlefield. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Isn't it true that the Crebilly farm is not part of the Brandywine Battlefield National Historic Landmark?
It's not part of the original landmark area that was designated in the 1960s. And it's important to note that the original designation didn't even have a map area. A few years later, they threw a map up. But for years, the National Park Service, through the American Battlefield Protection Program and the Chester County Planning Commission, have used a larger study area, especially when more information came out with the diaries that were discovered about the movement, especially the flanking movement from Kennett Square all the way up to almost Marshallton, and then back down through the Birmingham Road New Street corridor. Those areas had not been included originally because they didn't know that much about them. History is an ongoing information gathering process.
John.
But the designation has not formally been changed, but it's also not used. It's not used by the National Park Service for any importance.
John, if you could answer my question a little more succinctly, please.
Mr. Edelman, he's answering your question. It's not a yes/no answer.
I believe it is a yes/no answer, and then he can explain. He did not answer yes or no to my question. My question was, is it included in the historical national landmark for the Brandywine Battlefield?
Okay. It is not included on the 50-year-old map. It is included in the study area for landmark.
Thank you. Mr. Snook, you're not a historian. You don't hold yourself out as an expert in history. Is that correct?
I don't, but I maybe should. I am author of a statewide manual on local historic preservation ordinances. I've written more of them than anyone else in the Commonwealth. And I sat on the Westchester Borough HAR. I am Board of Supervisors Liaison to the East Bradford Historical Commission. And I sit on behalf of the county and the Brandywine Conservancy on the Brandywine Battlefield Historical Interpretation Plan Task Force.
Mr. Snook, you weren't qualified or accepted as an expert in history.
No, but I'm just letting you know.
I appreciate your experience, Mr.
Because I apologize for finding it annoying with those, and it's not you. Please forgive me. You are not annoying.
Thank you, Mr. Snook. I appreciate that. If I'm going to take anything from this evening, it'll be that. Following up on the history aspects, isn't it true that the zoning ordinance does not have a historic preservation requirement for historic structures or resources?
It does not at the moment.
Does the zoning ordinance also require preservation of structures or resources that are deemed eligible for the National Register of Historic Places?
No, that's a policy issue, though. Whenever Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission review comes in, notably with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which is involved whenever there's federal money or permitting involved. And I will say, however, that the zoning ordinance specifically calls for consistency with the comprehensive. The comprehensive plan specifically calls out all those issues. And the zoning ordinance does actually require inventory of historic resources in the flex section and indication as to whether or not, and ideally whether they will and how, be preserved. So, and of course, the comp plan goes further. There were amendments to make a more clear connection, which you sued about.
Okay, let me move on to my next question. John, isn't it true that the Crebilly Farm's eligibility for inclusion on the National Registry is not related to the Battle of Brandywine?
It is not. It is related in the particular designation to the country estate theme.
Thank you. Let's pull up Exhibit PC 25 again, please.
why it does that.
So, John, PC 25 again has multicolored lines on the superimposed on the, I guess, the conditional use plan. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And what does the yellow line depict again?
The yellow line is approximately the edge of what the county defined as the Brandywine Battlefield swath.
And is that yellow line a specific zoning ordinance provision?
No, not at the moment.
Okay. And what's the green line stand for?
The green line is the edge of the area designated in the comprehensive plan for open space, it also including the area that is designated for greenway.
Okay. And is that green line, is there a specific provision in the zoning ordinance for that green line?
The specific provision is an in-specific provision, but it is specific that development should be consistent, and including flex development, consistent with the comprehensive plan. And this comprehensive plan is relatively new, but predates this application.
And John, when again was this plan distributed to the Planning Commission? Was it during the first conditional use application or during this conditional use application?
No, it was before you started the conditional use hearings when Toll agreed to meet with the Township Planning Commission.
Okay, so right. it was prior to the first conditional use application?
Yes.
Okay. And I believe you testified that you were aware and involved in the potential alternative plan that Toll had introduced here as Exhibit A76. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, I wasn't involved with it, but I was aware of it and I reviewed it.
And you reviewed it?
Yeah.
And you issued a review letter on that alternative plan, is that correct?
I did back in the spring, right before COVID hit. And although that was a review of the slightly earlier version that had been presented to the Planning Commission.
Okay, and didn't the
by letter. But then I subsequently reviewed your newer plan, and my testimony that Kristen requested was based on that.
Okay, all right. And didn't the alternative plan incorporate some of, if not many of, your recommendations as well as other professional consultants' recommendations?
Yes. I mean, it did move some of the area that they are shown in red to the east. I just felt it wasn't enough, but it was a start, certainly in the start.
And didn't it also increase the trails around the property?
It did. As I noted, though, mostly they're looping into the property from edges, but there's not. They interact with the internal trails, and I just think most people would prefer to think of the internal trails as being their neighborhood trails and the perimeter as being where other people can go. I mean, I realize that's not necessarily how you design it intentionally, but I think it's how people think, and which is why I suggested a more clear, roughly perimeter trail that people other than the immediate residents could also use without going into the neighborhoods.
Sorry. Would you agree with me that the alternative plan greatly increased the pedestrian connectivity via trail system?
I do believe it did increase the pedestrian connectivity, although I don't have the plan in front of me at the moment.
Okay. And what is your understanding with respect to the Planning Commission's recommendation with respect to the alternative plan?
To be truthful, I actually never saw a specific recommendation from the Planning Commission on that.
Okay, fair enough. I don't have anything further from Mr. Stone. Thank you, John. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Turn now to Mr. Thompson for Neighbors for Crebilly.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm just going to I appreciate the questions, and I don't have anything further for Mr. Snow.
Okay. Ms. Labrum for Thornbury Township.
Yeah. Pat, not here.
She's no longer on?
No, I don't.
She was under Hugh Dunhue?
Oh, I see Hugh. Sorry. Go ahead.
No questions for Mr. Snook. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. From Crawford for Birmingham Township.
Here.
Yes, thank you, Pat. I do have a few questions, if I might, of John. John, you had mentioned in your direct testimony the potential for modifying the unit mix to achieve the goals that you referenced to move the development area further to the east. A fair statement?
Yes.
And I think you referenced also that the distance requirement between townhome buildings could be eased in order to allow more density concentration. Is that correct?
Yes, that's also correct.
Okay. Was it your intention in making that statement that the entire hypothetically permitted density of 319 total dwelling units could actually be achieved with a modification of the unit mix?
I think it could probably get pretty close, if not meet that, and the County Planning Commission suggested alternative did keep the number the same. And my goal was to promote better design, not take away units.
Understood. And if I understand the ordinance correctly, I believe twin dwelling units are also a permitted component of the unit mix. Is that correct?
I believe that is true. I'm not looking at the ordinance in front of me right now, but if I did, I couldn't see you all.
Could we put PC 25 back up for a moment?
Sure.
So, how many units roughly are in the red boxes that you've located there of single family?
Probably they're all single family, and without counting every single one, it's probably between 40 and 50.
Okay, so somewhere over between 10 and 15% of the total unit count for the max density.
Yes.
So, would it be feasible to, for example, to take roughly the same road construction, road plan for the eastern section, say east of the yellow line or possibly even the green line, and integrate twin dwellings in lieu of single-family homes to make up at least a substantial portion of the homes lost, the lots lost hypothetically in the red areas?
Yes, and the reduction in the road network would be a positive thing from a maintenance standpoint, as well as from the sheer distance of the houses in the ends of those red areas from the outside connector roads. But also, I'm assuming that if that all is moved, that the sewage area designated up in the southeast corner of the tract might be converted to townhouses and or twins to make up the mix, because some of the open space that is now in the red areas that's in the upland parts could become sewage disposal. And of course, if they end up getting public sewer, all the better from that standpoint, from a flexibility standpoint.
Are you aware of any discussion on behalf of the applicant for including what I would consider a middle type of housing, i.e. twin units in between the the more dense townhouses on the one hand and the less dense single homes on the other. It would seem to me to be a natural planning step to consider an interim housing type for this community.
I am not aware of any discussion. I certainly don't disagree with you, but you are the first person to bring it up to me.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Crawford. Mr. Spagman for Thornberry Farm Trust.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Snook. John, are you aware of Thornberry Farm directly to the south of the Crebilly Farm?
Yes, I am.
And Thornberry Farm, we house about 30 animals here, rescue horses, things like that people do riding. Are you familiar with the term bridle path?
Yes.
Are there bridle paths currently now on the Crebilly perimeter fence line, would you say?
As far as I know, at least informally.
Okay. Because one of the things that we do with our horses now is we currently do ride the perimeter there of Crebilly, and I was wondering, as with like the Radley Run developments over in Birmingham Township, is that a considered use in some developments for horse and other travels and running around the perimeter fence lines or the perimeter of a development?
Well, there's no reason why that couldn't be provided, even if separate from a walking and biking path or trail that might in fact best be paved. You obviously want a natural surface for your bridle paths.
So that would be something maybe similar to the Sandy Hollow Park that Birmingham Township did, with a paved trail but a horse and equestrian path around the outside that's just grass.
Yeah, and if they keep fence lines, there's no reason it couldn't go along the fence line. That would obviously not be expensive. It would just be a matter of continuing to allow it.
Agreed. What makes the Crebilly Farm, I think you said a national designation. What makes that designation possible?
Do you mean like for the National Register?
Yes, please, yes.
Somebody submitted to PHMC a proposal to determine whether it's eligible for the National Register or not, and PHMC agreed. I mean, obviously, for example, your farm would certainly be, I can't imagine not be eligible. It's just somebody has to do the work.
Okay. Have you been aware if a historic review's been done on the homes and structures of the farm?
Of Crebilly?
Of Crebilly, I'm sorry, yes.
Yes. I believe it was Bob Wise during the prior conditional use hearing did a survey. It was inadequate in my view because it really didn't push for adaptive reuse, but it did describe everything.
One possibility in creative adaptive reuse, the house, and I'm sorry if I don't know the name of the house or the age, that's along 926, known as the Tree on the Roof House. Is that something that would be considered as an adaptive reuse, to let that house stand and be re-resurrected, I guess?
Well, sure. I mean, as long as someone was willing to put the money into it, there's nothing to stop it.
So maybe that could be X'd out of the count and just be allowed to let toll or builder just segregate that lot off in order to maintain or at least save the structure.
Yes. I mean, obviously toll, especially on the perimeter where it's not in the middle of where they want primary development areas, to allow for that, I mean, they probably would want to be reimbursed for some value, which is not unreasonable, but somebody to do it is obviously going to have to put a lot of money into it, but at least making it feasible is a good thing.
Agreed. That's, it rightly should be. Are you familiar with the scale in the middle of Crebilly Farm?
I am. I've never actually seen it in person. I've been near it not knowing it was there. I was not aware of it until the Bob Wise report showed it.
I getting hay wagons on hay and then getting the hay weighed out. So it's a very unique structure. Cost me a lot of money, that hay scale. So, but is that something that could be preserved or worked around, just being left perhaps untouched as a relic?
It's possible, especially if they move development out of the area where it is. It's also something they might be, since it's not a large object, something that they could maybe make available for somebody else to preserve in a logical setting, you know, as opposed to in a museum.
Right. Well, one of the things I've found in some uses is try to find a no cost to a builder where you could put interpretive signage or something like that, where they can just work around it, not be dinged for it, but still have some historical value, perhaps.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, you were going to finish?
I was just going to say, anything like that, if it could be left where it is in a logical manner relative to the development, and say along a trail, and have an interpretive sign, that would be great. Obviously, you know, the developer has to the extent he can accommodate these things, it has to fit, obviously, other aspects of the development and marketing issues.
John, one question and all is, and I'm not sure exactly how to phrase this in all honesty, is one of the things that we have concern is deer with the farm, and with the open space getting grown over and things like that, and then housing, that would seriously impact our farming applications here. Are there mitigation efforts or things like that that Crebilly is doing now, or could be done once it goes to an HOA to help minimize those invasive deer species, as we would call them?
I don't know of anything being done now, nor obviously once the development's in place, then there's going to be more of a suburban smorgasbord for the deer. It's certainly not going to encourage them to go away. I think, unfortunately, the burden falls on to people like you to deal with it on your own property, because I don't know what can be done to narrow the population other than like archery, which you don't allow on your property.
Well, I know other places and do deer calls. I know Westtown School does it. Other places do that. And of course, just by making the stream paths mowed and low grass, it doesn't give them habitat to fester, so to speak. The last question I have is, do you believe conductivity to Thornbury Farm through 926 through a trail system would be appropriate?
Yes. I mean, to the extent it can be accommodated on your side, you know, in terms of making sense relative to what's going on your property. Like, maybe not all the way through it, but I think it would be great to have a trail up to Sandy Hollow, or even just to your community garden.
Well, that's what we're trying to do, up to Sandy Hollow and up to the farm market for interpretive signs or heritage center or other items for the battlefield tours, and also. Great, John, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Spackman. Any questions for Mr. Karakoff for Brandywine at Thornbury HOA?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. McFalls for Westminster Presbyterian Church?
No questions.
Thank you. Preeti Pinto for Radley Run 3 HOA?
Go ahead. I sent the request to unmute.